Now that we've learned a little bit about religion, I think it's important to move on to the other R's, I put it, rulers, right? Religion and rulers, which really are the foundation of Art History 1. If you look at a lot of what we talk about in Art History 1, a lot of it centers around religion and religious practice and the kind of art that's produced to support it. And the other part is rulership and the kind of art that's made to commemorate and celebrate rulers, right? So, rulership is really essential. And, we talked about in the Neolithic how having a leader, having a ruler, that was going to become something that was necessary, right, to have a fixed community. So the first ruler we look at here is the ruler Sargon, whose name, by the way, means true king. And, I'll let you guess whether that was really his real name, right, when he was born. No, right? He takes on the name Sargon because it means true king. And we find that a lot of rulers will do this. They'll take on a name that they think suggests their quality as a leader. This is especially true if you look at Chinese history. The emperors there actually would change their names multiple times during their rules to suggest different qualities as their rulership went along. So you would look at their grave markers, and often there'd be four or five names because they change it so frequently as conditions would change. So Sargon, he becomes ruler, and he's from the Akkadian period. So I talked about how there are these different subgroups. You'll note if you look at your vocab sheet, it starts with Sumerian, right, moves all the way down to Persian. And so the Sumerians were the original people in this area, and then they were overthrown by the Akkadians, who Sargon was the leader of. Later, the Sumerians will come back, the Neo Sumerians, right? So they don't take it lying down. And I bring this up because I want you to think about the struggle in this region that I mentioned previously. There's a lot of push and pull, there's a lot of power struggle that goes on in this area, which leads Sargon to really want a lot of complete control. Notice that his kind of nickname, right, was King of the Four Quarters. Quarters meaning north, south, east, and west, the four cardinal directions. So why does this mean king of the four quarters? It symbolically means if you look to the north, Sargon is king there. If you look to the south, he's king there too, and so on and so forth. So this idea that no matter where you go, Sargon rules. It's very much to me early kind of political rhetoric about I'm in charge wherever you may travel to, right? Make no mistake, Sargon is the law of this land. And we'll see over time how the rulers will actually expand this kind of rhetoric until you get to the Persians and they are the kings of the universe. So why stop with, kings of the four quarters? Why not be king of the universe? So we'll talk about how rulership, it sort of, it builds, on itself and often gets kind of out of control. And we definitely see this when we study Near Eastern culture. Another trick that Sargon used was to think about how do you control people? And one of the main things you have to do is make sure you have eyes in every camp. You can't really let anyone have autonomy or self control. You have to have somebody looking at every aspect of your culture and having sway over it. So notice that he sends his daughter to be a chief priestess in one of the religious communities, particularly the goddess Ningal, who is the moon goddess. Now, it's, maybe his daughter was religious, but I would say that we look at this more as a political statement, where his daughter, in a sense, could spy on the religious order. She could spy on the priests and the priestesses to a certain extent. If any of them were saying something like, we don't like this Sargon, we want to rise up against him. We, as the religious order, we have enough power, we can do that. He would hear about that. She would report back. So in a sense, he's keeping an eye on things that he needs to understand that they are in his camp, that they are under his control, that he doesn't want that to spin out of control. We see this later with leaders like Augustus. So when we talk about the Romans, we'll talk about how Augustus actually uses kind of like a three-pronged approach, where he says, I'm the princeps, I'm the man of the people, I'm the imperator, I'm the head of the military community, and I'm the Pontifex Maximus. I am the head of the religious order as well. So he's sort of like, anywhere you go, you see me, you see Augustus. So we believe that, Sargon starts this attitude of you control everything. If you want to lead, if you really want to be in control. But notice that everyone always loses control. If you look at his eyes, you'll notice they've been damaged. And I mentioned that the Sumerians would come back and overthrow the Akkadians So, there will be a time when his people are no longer in power, his group is no longer in power. Now, this kind of defacement, when we study art history, we talk about how this is very common because when you decide to overthrow a leader, let's say, or a regime, so here you have Saddam Hussein's statues after the Gulf War. Um, what you normally do is ritually deface them or ritually kill them in some kind of way, drag them through the street, attack their faces, as a way of showing you've defeated this person. So again, Sargon suffers this fate of defacement. Sargon's grandson can also be studied, another Akkadian leader, and we can look at his stele. Now, first off, we should speak about the term stele and what it means. You can hear it pronounced both ways, stele and stele. I think it really depends on how you learn it. Both are considered proper. Just depends, I think, on where you grew up and how you learn to say the word. So stele or stele. I grew up with the stele version, so that's still how I say it. But again, choose for yourself, I guess. What is a stele? It is a standing vertical monument. I often compare them to the early equivalent of a billboard that is meant to be somewhere proclaiming a message. Remember, these are visual people. Even cuneiform, as they're writing, is pictographic for a reason. And I often speak to the fact that even though they have cuneiform, probably only about 15 to 20% of the population, and that's being generous, was literate, could read it. So, when you're going to communicate with people in mass, you're probably going to make a monument like this. So they are standing vertical monuments. We assume these things were probably put up in the middle of towns so people could just see them very easily and know what the ruler was trying to say to them. You'll notice it's made out of stone, and I'd mentioned that stone wasn't very available to these people. So when you saw it, this must be an important person, right? So Naram Sin must have been someone of importance, and he was. This monument actually documents the defeat of the Lullaby people. So it's a battle, it's a military monument essentially. And you'll note that Naram Sin is marching up the monument, up the mountain, might we say, following his troops are following him. They are victorious, and he's ascending to the heavens, where you see these star-like shapes right at the top of the apex of the monument. Um, Notice that Naram Sin is the largest. To make sure that we're clear that he's Naram Sin, he's shown the largest. This is something you'll see here and also in Egyptian art. We call it hierarchy of scale. It means that the scale shows importance. Scale is size. So a bigger person, right, would show that they are more important. So we call that hierarchy of scale. Egyptians will use this very symbolically, especially like when they show a family. They'll show the father very big, the mother not as big, right, and the children very small, as a way of illustrating hierarchy of scale. Again, remember, these are symbolic renderers of arts, so they don't really care that, he's not a giant to them. He's just being shown as more important. They don't care that it doesn't make logical sense, right? And they're like, whatever, it doesn't matter. Um, you'll note that the idea of the gods here is still shown very abstractly. Later, we'll see that changes. So that's why I wanted to mention this very clearly. And I would say the Naram Sin still has a sort of reverent remove, respectful remove from the gods. There's something outside his comprehension, right? They are these stars up in the heavens. There's something he can't quite understand, right? So later we'll see in the next monument that Shumash is made into like a person. So it's sort of this, departure, right, from this idea of a reverent remove, might we say. And the idea of the gods being something unfathomable, something unexplainable. The other thing I always tell you about this monument is if you look at the two people in front of Naram Sin, they've always sort of, in a sense, come up for debate about, how you should interpret a monument. When I learned this monument, the way that it was kind of explained to me, this was late 90s, was that the one person was like, oh God, help me, here comes Naram Sin. And it kind of has this, like, hands to his face, and the other person was being stabbed. But you'll notice there's cuneiform written to the right of the monument, kind of down the mountain face. They translated enough of the cuneiform to realize that actually that's not what's happening at all. So again, sometimes just looking at an object, your interpretation can end up being flawed. It's unfortunate but true. You find more information, you're like, oh, that's not it. Supposedly they're actually celebrating Naram Sin. So the guy's playing like a horn, and the other guy's like, oh, hail Naram Sin, yay, he's fabulous. Like, yeah, that's a really different way to look at the monument than the way I learned it. So sometimes you get more information and that changes the interpretation of a piece. So you always have to keep that in mind when you're studying art history, especially some of these monuments, which can be rather fragmentary, right, in how they're presented. And the other monument I wanted to show you that's a stele is a stele of Hammurabi. And Hammurabi was a Babylonian, so he comes along, after the Akkadians. And you'll notice that as we go forward in Mesopotamian history, we notice that the way that they're dealing with the gods has changed a bit. I had mentioned that, if you look at Naram Sin, he's like the god should be something I can't fathom, I can't understand. Here, Shumash is shown as a person. He's shown, as sort of what we call personified. Uh, and that is an interesting step forward because when you really look at the way that most religions become sort of more, I'd say, stable, more solidified, it's usually around personified gods. It's around the gods in the sense of them looking like us, kind of, sorta, right? Being like us, kind of, sorta. We don't really get to humanism in gods till the Greeks, but you do start to see the personification of the gods. So even though Shumash is a sun god, notice that he's being kind of shoved in a human package here. By the way, Hammurabi is to the left, Shumash is to the right. So again, this idea of him as the sun god, and notice he's not really fitting in his human package all that great. He has kind of had these sunbeams coming off his shoulders. So it's like he's like, ow, it's kind of hurts. I'm the sun being shoved in a body. Not so great for me. But it gives a sense of personification, and we like personification of gods because they make them feel more accessible to us, more understandable to us as the worshiper. Now, this monument is very famous beyond just being an art piece. It is the law code of Hammurabi. So if you've studied Western history, I'm sure you've run into the law code of Hammurabi. And the law code, you'll notice the cuneiform is on the bottom half of the monument. Basically was the first comprehensive law code that really addressed every type of infraction that could be made. Anything that someone could do wrong, it was addressed here. And it was a very brutal kind of justice. If you've ever heard eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, that's Hammurabi. So he was not like, oh, please explain to me why you did this, and oh, I feel bad for you. No, he was like, you stole a loaf of bread, I'm cutting off your hand. We're done now. So it was very brutal justice. So again, we believe that this stele, notice it's also stone, so we assume it was meant to be permanent, important. We assume this stele was meant to stand in a town square, and we assume that it was not just a unique object, that probably there were many of these made and placed around the Babylonian region so people could see the law code. The picture, I always joke, is probably there because, again, most people weren't literate. So what are they getting off the picture? They're getting off the picture the idea that Shumash, you'll notice, is handing over the right to rule to Hammurabi. So if you look at Shumash, you'll notice he's handing him kind of a long stick-like object and then kind of a circular object. So he's handing those to Hammurabi, and Hammurabi's sort of like, oh, thank you, thanks so much, right, to the god. So what the people would interpret, even if they couldn't read the code, is, oh, the gods are telling Hammurabi he can rule over us and judge us, and it's the way of the gods, essentially. He's being given the stamp of approval, right, from the gods, essentially. So this would have legitimized the law code to them. This would have made it like, well, okay, I guess we have to, behave, we have to follow along. If you think about what these objects symbolize, right, we usually call one like the rod or the staff, the long one. And then the ring, right? We call that the ring or the line sometimes. Um, this idea that he could measure and judge and rule. If you look at rulers today, when they carry like a scepter and then a globe, that imagery descends from this imagery. So again, sometimes when you study art history, you realize how old certain symbols are. So go look at like a picture of a queen holding her scepter and her orb, it's from the rod and the line, essentially. So just an interesting sort of piece of trivia right there. And the last thing I want to mention is, notice with Hammurabi and Shumash, their hierarchy of scale is the same. Go back and look at Naram Sin, And you'll notice that he's not trying to be the same as the gods, you know. He would never try to be the gods. So there's a familiarity here that Hammurabi is suggesting with his interaction with Shamash and then also his size with Shamash. And a lot of students sometimes say, well, if Shamash got up, he'd be bigger. And I always say, well, is he going to? And then everyone's like, "Well, no." And I'm like, "You have to think about this very simply because they were simple visual readers. They weren't critically thinking about these objects. We are. They wouldn't. The people of this time would not. So yeah, he's never getting up. So that doesn't matter. That's really irrelevant, right, to our discussion. But again, it's interesting what he's trying to say about himself as a ruler. Notice, you know, king of the four quarters. Oh, I still have reverence for the gods. Now I'm kind of like, hey, buddy, what's up? You know, thanks for letting me rule. I always say that, you know, if you think about why people vote for people, they've done like studies about how, like George W. Bush, when he was elected president, a lot of people said, "Well, I thought I could have a beer with him." So funny enough, you know, people like to be ruled by people they feel some connection to or some sense of familiarity or you know, a congeniality or friendship. You know, they're like, well, I could hang out with that dude. You know, so he's all right. I'll vote for him. So I always look back at this and I'm like, oh, Hammurabi's kind of like, hey, Shamash, what's up? And Shamash is like, how you been doing? And again, they're very familiar with one another. So it's an interesting way for Hammurabi to suggest, you know, I am in charge, I am the ruler. That's what's important here. And again, this is a monument that I think helps us see that trajectory of rulership and how it's framed, right, in the Near Eastern region.